We are not turning to Stephen King, whom I introduced playfully with a reference to the horror writer Stephen King, but I actually wanted to do a serious introduction now, because Stephen published just last year a book called Grave New World, which I highly recommend for you to read, which is a book about the place where we actually are these days in economic and political terms. You're wrapping up Western-made globalization and trying to track a way forward, where you essentially say that the Chinese are really interested in globalization these days, but that doesn't necessarily spell good things for us. So, building on that, I wanted actually to return to you with a question I asked all the participants, and I will come to the other participants back with that question. Namely, what historical period do you think we are living in now? Is it the end of the story that has been running, all the posts, all the neos, all the lates, late capitalism, neo-mercantilism, post-globalization, or are we already in a new period and we should start looking for a noun instead of something in front?
Well, first of all, being called Stephen King is very handy for my book sales, because people obviously believe it's another author with a much more horrific and fictitious story. But I'm also slightly worried about saying there's a specific historical period that relates to where we are today, because history doesn't tend to repeat itself. There are always significant differences. I mean, you could point to, for example, the rise of China versus the US as the existing superpower as being the equivalent of the rise of Germany before the First World War relative to the existing superpower, namely the UK. You could refer to the Thucydides trap, which everyone talks about these days. But it seems to me that what we can say with some degree of confidence is that what people expected in the West back in 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down at the beginning of the end of Soviet-style communism, the expectations that emerged back then I don't think have been quite met in the way that the West itself had expected. Now, I'm particularly focused here on what Francis Fukuyama wrote in 1989 with his paper, The End of History, because within that, he made a series of claims that I think many Western politicians wanted to believe, regardless of the evidence. They wanted to believe these claims. And there were three big claims that came through. The first one was that Western liberal democracy was really the only successful game in town, and that countries elsewhere in the world, given the choice, given the chance, would definitely adopt those kinds of systems. The second big claim was that free market capitalism was the only economic system in town and would naturally spread through to the rest of the world. And it was ultimately a stabilizing force that would lead to much higher incomes elsewhere in the world. And there was a connected claim to that, which is that if free market capitalism spread and other countries got richer, then the West too would become richer, because there'd be an expansion of world trade, exports would pick up, Western jobs would therefore rise, investment would pick up domestically, and everything would be absolutely fine. And the third big claim, which is in one sense rather related to the idea of the spread of Western liberal democracy, but is the opposite claim, was the idea that authoritarian regimes would effectively die, that they would gradually disappear and be replaced with liberal democracies. Now, if you look at the experience since 1989, it's been rather different from those kinds of predictions, it seems to me. The first difference is that from the West's point of view, the economic outcomes have been significantly worse than was expected. And I think this is true on two different counts. The first one is that living standards in the West have grown much more slowly than had been projected 20 or 30 years ago. Much more slowly relative to other countries, most obviously China and India, but also much more slowly compared with the West's own economic history. Another big change, which of course we've heard about already this morning, was that the lower growth rates were also associated with a much greater focus on increases in income and wealth inequality. The third big issue, I guess, is that around the rest of the world, some of the most successful economies are those with very much authoritarian regimes, most obviously China. And it is worth stressing that if you look at China's development over the last 30 or 40 years, it is, I think, on an epic scale. It's much greater than I think people necessarily recognize it as being. So if you go back to living standards in China in 1980, they are the equivalent of those in the US in around about the 1780s. By 2010, so just 30 years later, Chinese living standards are up to those in the US in around about the 1930s. We've never seen such an epic transformation of living standards in such a short space of time for so many people. So this is, in one sense, a challenge to those kinds of views. It seems to me that over the last 10 to 15 years, particularly I think since the global financial crisis, which I think is best described as a Western financial crisis, frankly, because many other countries weren't affected as much as the West was, it seems to me that the West has had a kind of rethink of the benefits of globalization. And you could say that the love affair that came through in 1989 with globalization has turned sour, that many Western countries have adopted a new kind of political narrative. Now, the narratives of the past have been typically left versus right, but the narratives now, I think, are not so much left versus right, but rather globalists versus isolationists. What you can see here is that across and within different political parties, across different parts of the political spectrum, you have more isolationists beginning to come through. So if you take, for example, the US before the last presidential election, I would argue, some people might disagree with this, but although Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump have lots of differences, there was one thing that in one sense united them, which was a suspicion of globalization, a suspicion about what the rest of the world was doing to the US. Bernie Sanders famously said at one point during the Democrat nominee debate that globalization hadn't worked for the US, and nor had it worked for any country anywhere else in the world, which is factually untrue in my view, but nevertheless it was an observation that was made, which makes him sound like an isolationist. If you take the UK currently, one of the odd things about the UK is that we have two political parties, both of whom are effectively either led or controlled by isolationists for different reasons. Theresa May not be an isolationist herself, but there's a whole bunch of Brexiteers within her party who want to separate the UK from Europe and perhaps want to build a better connection with the rest of the world, but it's unclear how they're going to do that. But on the Labour side, Jeremy Corbyn arguably wants to build a socialist utopia behind closed doors within the UK. So they're both isolationist movements.
But is it a recoil from globalization, a short-term trend, a short-term tick, or are we really for a long-term isolationist stint in politics?
Well, it's difficult to say because the long term is always tricky to forecast. But I make the following observations, that as an economist, I can point to other reasons why the West has difficulties, which have got nothing to do with globalization. I can point to the impact of technology in hollowing out jobs and different kinds of work. I can point to the fact that it's led to a downward pressure on wages in a whole range of different industries that's made people feel upset and hacked off, basically. I can point to educational failures in the West. If you look at these PISA tests, which look at...
we are polling greatly in PISA tests, so we love PISA tests.
Well, that's great. I mean, I'm delighted for you in Poland. But when you look at the UK, it's slumped down the pecking order. You look at the US, it's on some of these measures 40th or 45th worldwide, which is no position for supposedly the world's most powerful nation to be in. It's not something which is particularly good. If you look at social mobility, there's evidence that social mobility has declined over the course of the last few decades. Which
in the West?
In the West, yes. So when you look at these trends, you might say, okay, there are some fixes for these. We can stop technology from advancing. But that's going to be very difficult and probably not desirable. You can do something on the education front, but you're still left with a lost generation that can't easily break through, having missed out on education over the course of the last few years. Social mobility is also quite difficult to deal with. So what you tend to have is a move towards a simplistic political narrative. And the simplistic political narrative, in my view, is a them and us narrative. It basically says, rather than globalization being a story whereby everyone potentially benefits, which is how people saw it back in 1989, globalization is a threat to people's prosperity in individual countries. So you begin to say that the problems that we have in country A are caused by the behavior of people in country B or C, or citizens in country A who are not in the majority, or whatever it might be. A whole range of different blame games come through. And what it also means is that the international organizations that in one sense set the rules of the game since the end of the Second World War themselves are blamed for the difficulties that begin to emerge. Now, as an economist, again, I would suggest that there are a series of international reforms that one can have which would strengthen the role of international institutions to make the world perhaps a better place. But the irony in one sense is that although I could argue in favor of that, I think the political dynamics within individual Western countries are moving away from the idea of supporting the creation of further international agreements and international institutions. There is, I think, a retreat into the sanctity, the safety of the nation state, And that's something which we know from previous history is rather discouraging. Now, having said all that, it is worth stressing that the difficulties the West have are not really replicated elsewhere in the world. And it seems to me that if you take China as an example, China does want to pick up the baton of globalization. It recognizes the US has possibly dropped it to a certain degree or is less enthusiastic than was the case previously. If you go back to last year's Davos rather than this year's Davos and look at President Xi's speech about the importance of China leading economic globalization, it's all there. The problem, though, is, of course, that you're talking about a country which is authoritarian, not a liberal democracy, leading a different version, if you like, of globalization. And when you have the Chinese version and the American version bumping into each other in different parts of the world, that's where you've got the risk of significant frictions coming through. So I think the Korean story is an interesting part of that story.
I understand the argument. The chief point of the argument is that we are out of the driving seat of globalization and we're feeling uncomfortable with that.
Not just out of the driving seat, but also a sense that it's no longer working for the West in the way that it was once previously.
Yeah. I wanted to bridge from that, because we have been talking about politics, to the global economy. Because politics is turning, some say populists, others say nationalists, others say, in purely descriptive terms, isolationist, as you said. But we are still stuck, or perhaps beneficiaries of a global economic system which is based on trade and the lack of frontiers, which are being now reimposed in people's minds for now, not in geographical terms. So my question is this: can a free trade-based global economy thrive in an environment of resurgent nation states in the midterm?
So the answer is it can, but it's worth stressing that the approach we have towards free trade today has changed compared to where it was 20 or 30 years ago. So the World Trade Organization has not managed to push a single free trade deal through. It's been less successful than GATT. Admittedly, there are rules of the game for countries to engage with each other, but the progress is less than it was. We have the emergence of regional trade deals, which in one sense are a poor cousin of global multilateral trade deals. So the fact that they've emerged as regional trade deals tells you that things have gone into reverse to a certain degree. You have the US particularly pushing for bilateral trade deals of one sort or another, which further undermines the notion of a multilateral deal where there's a rules-based system for everybody. So things can certainly do better. But I think the institutions that we have are not as successful perhaps they might have been 20 or 30 years ago. It's worth going back to the end of the Second World War and what happened in the 50s and 60s, particularly for the developed world. This remarkable reduction in tariffs, a remarkable shift in terms of engagement with one another, and the remarkable expansion of bilateral trade flows from country A to country B to country C. It was an extraordinary story. The other thing I'd note is that when it comes to globalization, there's obviously a lot of focus on trade, because it's what people tend to look at generally. But actually the biggest single driver of globalization over the last 50 or 60 years is not so much trade, it's capital. It's capital flows, movements across borders. That's still very high currently, but I wonder, as a sort of retreat into the sanctity and safety of the nation state, whether those capital flows, for one reason or another, will be reduced, maybe through regulatory changes, maybe through a distaste for global companies that are seen to be tax dodgers or whatever it might be. All these reasons might be there to actually reduce that flow of capital. And also a sense that perhaps by reducing that flow of capital, a nation can regain its sovereignty from the rigors or the discipline or the corruption of international capital.